On the evening of April 14th, 1814, the chandeliers of Lord Ashworth's ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, casting their golden glow upon the assembled cream of London society as the season opened with all its customary splendour and cruelty. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the third pillar from the eastern wall, a position she had occupied so many times across 6 seasons that she half wondered if the marble had begun to mould itself to the shape of her shoulder. Her lavender gown, though well made and perfectly respectable, had graced this same body at no fewer than 4 balls the previous year, and she suspected several sharp-eyed matrons had already noted its reappearance with satisfaction, adding it to their mental catalogue of evidence that the middle Whitmore daughter had thoroughly and irreversibly failed. The cool spring air drifted through windows cracked open to combat the press of bodies, carrying with it the faint sweetness of the garden below, though Eleanor barely registered the pleasant scent as her attention fixed itself on maintaining the expression of serene unconcern she had perfected over years of practice. Across the room, her younger sister Lydia sparkled like a freshly minted coin, her golden curls catching the light as she laughed at something her dance partner whispered, and Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of genuine affection and quiet resignation that accompanied watching her family's hope flourish where she herself had withered. The whispers reached her as they always did, carried on currents of air and malice. 2 young women in silk standing close enough for Eleanor to catch every poisoned word without the speakers ever knowing or perhaps caring whether she heard. "Such a pity about the elder Miss Whitmore," one murmured behind her fan, "though I suppose at 27 one can hardly call her Miss Whitmore any longer without feeling rather absurd about it." Her companion laughed softly. "My mother says she has been out for 6 seasons now, can you imagine? 6 whole seasons, and not a single offer worth mentioning, though I hear Mr. Collins nearly proposed 2 years ago before thinking better of it. They say her eyes are too clever by half. Quite unsettling, really. And that she reads philosophy of all things." Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the dancers, on Lydia's graceful turns, on anything but the speakers, while something small and tired curled tighter in her chest. Lady Harriet Greville caught her eye from across the room, her dearest friend's expression soft with the kind of concerned sympathy Eleanor could not bear to acknowledge, so she offered a slight smile and the smallest shake of her head, a silent reassurance that she was quite well, perfectly fine, managing splendidly as she always did. A ripple of heightened energy passed through the ballroom then, conversations shifting in pitch and intensity, and Eleanor glanced toward the entrance to see a tall figure in immaculate black evening clothes standing at the threshold, his dark hair and striking features causing a visible flutter among the assembled young ladies. The Duke of Ravenscroft had arrived, though Eleanor, turning back to watch her sister accept another dance, barely registered his presence at all. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The terrace stretched before Eleanor like a sanctuary of shadow and silence, the jasmine climbing the stone balustrade releasing its sweet perfume into the cool April night as she settled onto a small bench, half hidden by an ornamental urn, and withdrew from her reticule the slim volume she had smuggled past her mother's notice, Seneca's Letters, its leather cover worn soft from years of handling. The music from the ballroom drifted through the cracked doors behind her, muffled and distant, and she breathed deeply for the first time since arriving, letting the knot in her chest loosen as she opened to the page she had marked with a ribbon. The moonlight fell generous and pale across the terrace, sufficient to read by if one did not mind straining slightly, and Eleanor did not mind, had indeed read by worse light on countless evenings when escape demanded improvisation. She had managed perhaps 3 pages when footsteps on the flagstones announced she was no longer alone, and she looked up with the particular expression of polite discouragement she had perfected for unwanted interruptions, prepared to send some lost guest back toward the ballroom with cool efficiency. The man who stood at the terrace's edge was tall, his dark evening clothes rendering him almost part of the shadows except where moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face and the slight disorder of his dark hair, as if he had raked his fingers through it in frustration. He had not yet seen her in her sheltered corner, and his posture spoke of someone seeking escape rather than company, his shoulders releasing their rigid set as he breathed in the garden air with evident relief. Eleanor ought to have announced her presence, propriety demanded it, but something in his obvious need for solitude made her hesitate, and in that hesitation he turned and discovered her, his expression shifting from surprise to something she could not quite read. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly pleasant. "I did not realize the terrace was occupied." Eleanor closed her book but did not rise, studying him with the frank assessment of a woman who had long ago ceased caring what impression she made. "It is a large terrace, sir. I dare say there is room enough for 2 people seeking refuge from the extraordinary tedium within." His eyebrows rose slightly, and she saw his mouth curve in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You find the ball tedious, then?" She considered dissembling, offering the polite nothing that society demanded. But the moonlight and the jasmine and the blessed quiet made her reckless. "I find that balls are much the same as they have ever been, an elaborate ritual of display wherein everyone pretends to be something they are not, while judging others for identical pretenses, and I have attended quite enough of them to know precisely how this evening will unfold without needing to witness it firsthand." He moved closer then, not presumptuous but curious, as if she were a species of creature he had not previously encountered. "And what do you find preferable to such rituals?" She lifted her book slightly. "Seneca, at present, who at least has the virtue of being honest about human folly rather than participating in it so enthusiastically." His laughter, soft and genuine, surprised them both. The conversation that followed surprised Eleanor in ways she could not have anticipated, for the stranger proved himself not merely tolerant of her sharp tongue, but genuinely appreciative of it, responding to her observations with insights of his own that revealed a mind equally weary of pretense and hungry for substance. They spoke of Seneca's thoughts on the shortness of life, and he quoted a passage from memory that made her look at him with new interest, wondering what manner of gentleman attended balls with philosophy tucked away in his thoughts rather than calculations of dowries and connections. The jasmine scent grew stronger as the night deepened around them, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into the conversation in a way she had not experienced in years, perhaps ever, certainly not with a man whose features grew more striking the longer she studied them in the generous moonlight. He asked her opinion on whether society could ever reform itself, and she laughed, a real laugh rather than the polite simulation she usually offered, and told him that society was rather like a garden that had been planted by committee, everyone so concerned with what the neighbors might think that they all grew identical roses and called it beauty. The word seemed to catch his attention, and he tilted his head slightly, regarding her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "You have strong opinions about roses," he observed, and something in his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Eleanor considered deflecting, offering some light dismissal, but the night and the solitude and his unexpected presence had loosened something in her, some careful restraint she usually maintained without conscious thought. "Roses are what men send when they cannot be bothered to know a woman," she said, her voice carrying the weight of every bouquet that had never arrived for her, and every one she had watched delivered to Lydia with cards full of empty flattery. "They are the currency of laziness. The gesture a gentleman makes when he wishes to appear thoughtful without undertaking the burden of actual thought, sir. And every woman in that ballroom has received enough roses to know precisely how little they signify. He was quiet for a long moment, and she wondered if she had finally said something too sharp, too bitter, too revealing of the disappointment she usually kept so carefully hidden. But when she glanced at his face, she found him watching her with something that looked almost like wonder, as if she had handed him a key to a door he had not known existed. "Eleanor," came a voice from the ballroom doors, and she turned to see Harriet's silhouette against the golden light within, her friend's tone carrying both concern and curiosity. "Your mother is asking after you, and Lydia wishes to leave soon." Eleanor rose, suddenly aware that she had been sitting alone with a stranger for an entirely improper length of time, though propriety had been the furthest thing from her mind. She tucked her Seneca back into her reticule and offered the man a small nod. "I hope you find something worth your time inside, sir." She did not wait for his response, did not look back as she crossed the terrace toward Harriet, did not see the way he watched her disappear into the light, with an expression that had not crossed his features in a very long time indeed. The morning sun fell through the breakfast-room windows with cheerful indifference to Eleanor's state of mind, casting warm rectangles of light across the worn tablecloth and illuminating the modest spread of toast and preserves that constituted the Whitmore family's morning meal, and she found herself stirring her tea with unusual attention, her thoughts returning again and again to the terrace, to the moonlight, to the stranger whose name she had never learned, and whose face she could not seem to banish from her memory. No matter how sternly she reminded herself that such foolishness was beneath a woman of 27 who had long ago accepted her position in the world. Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore presided over the table with the anxious energy that had characterized her since her husband's death 2 years prior, her attention fixed entirely upon Lydia, who glowed with the particular radiance of a young woman who had danced 4 times at her first major ball and received compliments from no fewer than 3 eligible gentlemen. "You cannot imagine, Mamma, how Mr. Crawford looked at me during the second dance," Lydia was saying, her golden curls catching the light as she gestured with enthusiasm. "And Lady Pembroke herself remarked that my gown was the finest she had seen all evening." Mrs. Whitmore clutched her hands together with desperate hope, her eyes bright with the calculations of a mother who knew that the family's modest estate could not sustain them much longer without an advantageous marriage. "And did you speak with anyone of particular consequence, my darling? Anyone who might call upon us this week?" Eleanor lifted her teacup and said nothing, accustomed to these conversations that flowed around her like water around a stone, neither seeking her contribution nor noticing her silence. And she thought, instead of Seneca and moonlight, and a voice that had laughed with genuine amusement at her sharp observations rather than recoiling from them. The post arrived with the clatter of the front door and the hurried steps of their single remaining housemaid, and Mrs. Whitmore seized upon the small stack of cards and correspondence with eager fingers, sorting through invitations and notices with practiced speed, before pausing at a letter from her friend Mrs. Aldridge. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed, her voice rising with the particular pitch reserved for scandal. "It says here that the Duke of Ravenscroft was seen in close conversation with a woman on the terrace during the ball, a private conversation that lasted quite some time, and no one knows who she was." Lydia's eyes widened with delicious interest. "The Duke of Ravenscroft," she repeated, her voice hushed with awe. "They say he has rejected every eligible lady for 10 years, that his standards are impossibly high, that he is wealthy beyond imagination." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly against her teacup, a small movement that no one observed, and she kept her expression perfectly composed as her mother continued reading aloud, as Lydia speculated about which fortunate lady had captured such unprecedented attention, as neither of them glanced toward the middle daughter, who sat in her usual chair by the window, invisible as always, holding within her chest a secret that fluttered like a caged bird against her ribs. Lady Pembroke's afternoon tea on April 17th, 1814, was precisely the sort of gathering Eleanor usually endured with practiced invisibility, a collection of society's most determined gossips, arranged artfully around delicate china cups and plates of cucumber sandwiches, their conversation a carefully orchestrated symphony of compliments that concealed barbs and observations that served as warnings, and she had positioned herself in her customary corner near the window, where the light was poor and the traffic of guests rarely ventured, her blue muslin dress chosen specifically for its ability to fade into the wallpaper, her copy of Marcus Aurelius tucked discreetly beside her in case the conversation grew too tedious to bear without philosophical fortification. She had spent the past 3 days forcibly evicting the stranger from her thoughts, reminding herself with stern regularity that moonlit conversations with handsome gentlemen were precisely the sort of foolishness that led sensible women to disappointment, that whoever he had been, he had surely forgotten her the moment she disappeared into the ballroom, that the flutter in her chest when she recalled his laugh was simply indigestion from cook's questionable fish pie. The room hummed with its usual undercurrent of speculation and judgment. Lady Isabella Montague, holding court near the fireplace, in a gown of palest pink that probably cost more than the Whitmore household's annual food budget, her golden curls arranged in an elaborate confection that must have required hours of attention, her laugh carrying across the room with the practiced musicality of a woman who knew precisely how to command attention without appearing to seek it. Eleanor was contemplating whether she could slip away to the garden unnoticed when the room's energy shifted with the sudden electricity of unexpected arrival. Conversations faltering mid-sentence, teacups freezing halfway to lips, every female head turning toward the doorway with the synchronized precision of flowers following the sun, and she looked up from her corner to see him, the stranger from the terrace, standing in the entrance with an expression of polite boredom that somehow only enhanced his devastating handsomeness, and her heart performed a traitorous leap that she immediately and furiously suppressed. "The Duke of Ravenscroft," Lady Pembroke announced with barely concealed triumph at having secured such a prize for her modest gathering. "We are so honoured by your presence," and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the identity she had never learned crashed over her like cold water. The realization that she had spent an evening dismissing and lecturing and laughing with the most eligible and particular man in all of England settling into her stomach like a stone. Lady Isabella materialized at his side with the speed of a predator scenting wounded prey, her hand finding his arm with proprietary ease, her voice carrying that particular purring quality reserved for men of exceptional fortune. And Eleanor watched as society's reigning beauty led society's most elusive bachelor toward the refreshment table, feeling suddenly foolish for ever imagining that their terrace conversation had meant anything at all to a man who could have anyone he wanted. She returned her attention to her book with fierce determination, but the words blurred before her eyes, and she did not see Frederick's gaze sweep the room with quiet purpose until it found her blue dress in the shadowed corner, did not notice the slight smile that crossed his features, did not observe the deliberate way he extracted himself from Lady Isabella's grasp, and began moving through the crowd toward the one woman who was trying desperately not to look at him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and her name in his voice sent an involuntary shiver down her spine as she looked up to find him standing before her, his eyes warm with recognition and something else she dared not name. "I had hoped to find you here. I wished to ask what you are reading today." The morning of April chapter 18th, 1814, began with the sort of ordinary quietness that Eleanor had learned to appreciate in a household perpetually focused on her sister's prospects. The pale spring light filtering through the drawing-room curtains as she sat with her embroidery and tried very hard not to think about the Duke of Ravenscroft, or the way he had looked at her at Lady Pembroke's tea, or the unsettling warmth that had spread through her chest when he had sought her out in her shadowed corner and asked about her book as though her answer genuinely mattered to him, and she had nearly succeeded in convincing herself that the entire encounter had been a momentary aberration, a duke's idle curiosity about an oddity. When the front door knocker sounded with unusual authority, and their housemaid appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained astonishment, carrying an enormous arrangement of red roses so lavish and abundant that Eleanor could smell their heavy sweetness from across the room. Whitmore dropped her needlework with a gasp, her hand flying to her chest as she rose from her chair, and Lydia abandoned all pretense of practicing her scales at the pianoforte to rush forward with gleaming eyes, and both of them converged upon the flowers with the desperate hunger of women who had long ago learned to calculate the cost of every bloom. "For Miss Eleanor Whitmore," the maid announced, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across her mother's face and settled into Lydia's features as something complicated and not entirely pleased. Eleanor remained frozen in her chair, her embroidery needle suspended mid-stitch, as her mother seized the small card, tucked among the crimson petals, and read aloud the words from an admirer in a voice that trembled between hope and disbelief, and she watched her family flutter and exclaim and speculate about which gentleman could possibly have sent such an extravagant gesture to the daughter they had long ago written off as unmarriageable. But Eleanor knew. She knew with a certainty that settled cold and sharp in her stomach exactly who had sent them and exactly why, and the knowledge transformed the beautiful blooms before her into something that looked remarkably like a test she was determined not to fail. She rose from her chair with deliberate calm, crossed the room to the writing desk where cream paper embossed with her initials awaited, and dipped her pen in ink while her mother asked frantic questions she did not answer, while Lydia watched with growing confusion, while her heart pounded against her ribs with something that might have been fear, or might have been exhilaration, or might have been the terrifying freedom of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The note she wrote was brief, the words flowing from her pen with the sharp clarity of conviction. "You will have to do better than roses, Your Grace." She folded the paper with steady hands, tucked it among the velvet petals, and instructed the waiting servant to return the entire arrangement to its sender, ignoring her mother's horrified shriek, ignoring Lydia's whispered declaration that Eleanor had finally lost her mind completely, ignoring every rule she had ever been taught about gratitude and propriety and the desperate importance of encouraging wealthy suitors, because she had spent 6 seasons being overlooked and dismissed, and she would not, she absolutely would not, settle for being courted by a man who had not been listening when she told him exactly who she was. The study at Ashford House on the evening of April the 18th, 1814, was a sanctuary of masculine order and quiet opulence, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes that Frederick had actually read rather than merely collected for display, its mahogany desk scattered with correspondence he had been ignoring in favor of staring at the fire and contemplating the extraordinary woman who had occupied his thoughts with increasing persistence since that moonlit terrace conversation 4 nights ago. And he was in precisely this state of distracted contemplation when his butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of carefully masked bewilderment, carrying a silver tray upon which rested not a calling card or letter, but the entire elaborate arrangement of red roses Frederick had sent to the Whitmore household that very morning, their velvet petals now slightly wilted from their journey across London and back, their extravagant beauty somehow diminished by the unmistakable fact of their rejection. Thomas Sinclair, who had been sprawled in the leather armchair by the window, pretending to read while actually observing his friend's unusual preoccupation with undisguised curiosity, sat up straighter as Frederick rose from his desk and approached the returned bouquet with the cautious fascination of a man encountering a creature he had never seen before. And when Frederick extracted the small, cream-colored note tucked among the stems and unfolded it with fingers that were not entirely steady, Thomas watched his friend's face transform through a series of expressions that he had never witnessed in all their years of friendship. Shock, then confusion, then something that looked remarkably like delight breaking across features usually schooled into aristocratic indifference. "You will have to do better than roses, Your Grace," Frederick read aloud, and the words hung in the air between them like a challenge issued across a battlefield, and Thomas let out a bark of startled laughter that seemed to surprise even himself, declaring that the woman was either completely mad or utterly magnificent, and possibly both. And Frederick looked up from the note with an expression that Thomas would later describe to his wife as the moment he knew his friend was irretrievably lost, because the Duke of Ravenscroft, who had never been denied anything in his privileged life, who had rejected heiresses and diamonds of the first water with careless ease, who had made society's most beautiful women weep with his indifference, was smiling with the genuine, unguarded joy of a man who had finally found something worth wanting. She remembered, Frederick said quietly, more to himself than to Thomas. She remembered exactly what she said about roses on the terrace. She was testing whether I had actually listened, or whether I was merely going through the expected motions, and she found me wanting, and rather than simpering and accepting my inadequate gesture, she had the magnificent audacity to throw it back in my face and demand better. Thomas pointed out that most men would consider such behavior impossibly rude, that Eleanor Whitmore had just insulted a duke and rejected a gift worth more than her family probably spent on food in a month. But Frederick was already moving to his desk, already reaching for paper and pen, already planning his next approach with the focused intensity he usually reserved for matters of parliament or estate management. And when he looked up at Thomas with eyes bright with determination, his voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. "I am going to marry that woman, Thomas, and she is going to make me earn every single moment of her regard, and I find that I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of a woman who refuses to be impressed by anything less than genuine effort." The afternoon of April 21st, 1814, found Eleanor wandering the familiar shelves of Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly with the desperate gratitude of a woman seeking sanctuary, her fingers trailing along leather spines as she tried to lose herself in the comforting smell of paper and ink and possibility. Because 3 days had passed since she had committed the unforgivable act of returning a duke's roses, with a note that her mother still described in tones of horrified disbelief. And in those 3 days there had been no further contact, no response, no indication that Frederick Ashford had found her challenge intriguing rather than insulting, and Eleanor had told herself this was precisely what she wanted, that she had successfully discouraged a man who would only have disappointed her eventually, that the hollow ache beneath her ribs was relief rather than regret, and she was almost beginning to believe it when a familiar voice spoke from behind her, low and warm with barely contained amusement. "I have been reliably informed that roses are what men send when they cannot be bothered to know a woman, Miss Whitmore, so I thought perhaps this might serve as better proof that I was listening." She turned to find the Duke of Ravenscroft standing in the narrow aisle between philosophy and history, the afternoon light from the shop windows illuminating the sharp planes of his face and the genuine smile that transformed his usually austere features. And in his hands he held not flowers but a book, its leather binding worn soft with age, its gilt lettering spelling out words that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Seneca's Letters, a first edition, the very text she had been reading on that moonlit terrace when a stranger had wandered into her solitude and changed everything. "You found one?" she said, and her voice emerged smaller than she intended, stripped of its usual protective tartness, because no one had ever given her a gift, that proved they had truly seen her, truly heard her, truly understood what she valued, and the weight of that recognition pressed against her chest with an intensity that frightened her. It took some effort, he admitted, stepping closer with the book extended toward her like an offering. And when she took it from his hands, their fingers brushed, and neither of them pretended it was an accident. Eleanor opened the cover to find an inscription on the flyleaf in handwriting she did not yet know well enough to recognize. For Eleanor, who taught me that some women cannot be won with beauty alone, but must be convinced with substance. He had used her Christian name, and the intimacy of that presumption should have offended her, should have prompted a sharp correction about propriety and appropriate address. But instead, she found herself blinking rapidly against the sting behind her eyes as she asked quietly why he was doing this. Why he was pursuing a woman who had given him every reason to walk away. And Frederick Ashford looked at her with an expression that held no pretense, no calculation, no aristocratic mask, only the raw honesty of a man who had perhaps never before had to explain himself and was discovering he wanted to. And he said simply, "Because you are the first person in a decade who has made me feel like trying." The rain against Hatchard's windows grew heavier as Eleanor clutched the precious volume of Seneca to her chest like a shield, and she found herself retreating deeper into the bookshop's back alcove, with Frederick following as naturally as if they had done this 100 times before, the narrow space between towering shelves creating an intimacy that propriety would never have permitted in any ballroom or drawing room, and she knew she should manufacture an excuse to leave, should insist on braving the weather rather than remaining here with him in this dangerous proximity. But the truth was that she did not want to go, and that wanting terrified her more than any scandal ever could. "I expected you to be offended," she admitted quietly, her eyes fixed on the rain streaming down the window rather than on his face. "I expected you to dismiss me as a rude eccentric not worth the trouble, and I told myself that was for the best, that it was better to drive you away with my sharpness than to wait for you to discover I was not worth your time and watch you retreat with polite excuses." Frederick was silent for a long moment, and when she finally gathered the courage to look at him, she found an expression on his aristocratic features that she could not immediately name, something that looked almost like recognition, and he said softly that no one had ever challenged him before, son, that he had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who agreed with everything he said and wanted only what his title and fortune could provide, and that her returned roses had been the first genuine thing to happen to him in longer than he cared to remember. "You do not understand?" Eleanor said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words she had never spoken aloud to anyone. "What it means to be a woman of 27, with no fortune and no beauty and nothing to recommend her except a sharp tongue that society considers a liability rather than an asset. To know that any attention from a man of your position must be either charity or cruelty, because it could not possibly be genuine interest to have spent 6 seasons watching everyone look through you as if you were made of glass, and to fear that hoping for anything different will only make the inevitable disappointment more devastating." She had not meant to say so much, had not meant to strip herself so bare before a man she barely knew, but the words had escaped like prisoners too long confined, and she braced herself for his retreat, for the careful extraction of a man who had glimpsed something uncomfortable and wished to unsee it. But instead, Frederick Ashford reached out and took her hand in his fingers warm and steady around hers. And when he spoke, his voice held none of the polished charm she had come to expect from dukes and their ilk, but only a rough sincerity that made her chest ache. "Then I shall have to prove to you, Eleanor Whitmore, that I am neither charitable nor cruel, but simply a man who has finally found a woman worth the effort of being known by, and if it takes me the rest of my life to convince you that my interest is as genuine as your wit is sharp, then I shall consider that life well spent. The evening of April 25th, 1814, arrived with the particular electricity that precedes a storm, and Eleanor stood at the edge of Lord and Lady Harrington's musicale in a gown of soft green that Harriet had insisted brought out the warmth in her complexion, her heart beating with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the pianist's accomplished performance, and everything to do with the knowledge that Frederick would be here tonight. That 4 days had passed since he had held her hand in that quiet alcove, while rain streamed down the windows and spoken words that she had replayed so many times they had worn smooth as river stones in her mind, and she was trying very hard not to look toward the entrance, when the whispers began, that familiar rustle of silk and speculation that announced his arrival, and she felt him before she saw him, felt the weight of his gaze finding her across the crowded room with an accuracy that suggested he had been searching for nothing else. And when he crossed directly toward her, without pausing to acknowledge the dozens of more suitable women who turned hopefully in his direction, Eleanor's carefully maintained composure nearly shattered completely. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the formality of her name on his lips felt like a shared joke after the intimacy of that afternoon. "I believe the next dance is a waltz, and I find myself in desperate need of a partner who will not bore me with discussions of the weather." She should have demurred, should have cited propriety or her own poor dancing, or any of the dozen excuses that spinsters were expected to offer when unexpectedly elevated. But instead she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor while the room erupted in barely concealed astonishment, and she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath and Lydia's confused whisper, and beneath it all, the venomous hiss of Lady Isabella Montague declaring to her companions that she simply could not understand what his Grace found so amusing about his little charity project. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, and though she kept her feet moving in the patterns of the waltz and her face arranged in something approximating calm, Frederick must have felt her stiffen because his hand tightened at her waist and he leaned closer to murmur, "What did she say?" And Eleanor tried to deflect with lightness, tried to dismiss it as nothing of consequence, but he had already followed her gaze to where Isabella stood, smirking with triumphant malice, and something in his expression hardened into a cold fury that transformed his handsome features into something almost frightening. "You are not a charity project," he said quietly, fiercely, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the crowded ballroom disappear. "You are not a joke, or a dare, or an amusement. And if I must spend the rest of this season proving to every person in this room that my interest in you is the most genuine thing I have ever felt, then I shall consider it time well spent. But first I need you to tell me that you believe me, Eleanor. I need you to trust that what I see when I look at you is not what they see." And Eleanor, who had spent 6 seasons learning to expect nothing, found herself blinking back tears as she whispered that she was trying, that she wanted to believe him more than she had ever wanted anything, and his answering smile held a tenderness that made her fragile hope feel almost possible. The morning of April 28th, 1814, broke clear and golden over Hyde Park, and Eleanor found herself mounted on a magnificent chestnut mare named Artemis, whose coat gleamed like burnished copper in the early spring sunlight. The horse having arrived at the Whitmore household that morning with a note from Frederick indicating that he thought she might enjoy a proper ride rather than the sedate plodding that passed for equestrianism among society ladies. And though her mother had nearly fainted at the impropriety of accepting such a loan, and Lydia had pouted with undisguised jealousy, Eleanor had donned her worn riding habit with its slightly frayed cuffs and faded navy wool, and presented herself at the park, where Frederick waited astride his own black stallion with an expression of barely contained anticipation that made her heart stutter in her chest. She had not told him that she could ride, had not mentioned the summers spent at her grandmother's country estate before the money ran out. The long afternoons racing across open fields with a freedom that London's drawing rooms had never permitted, and so his face when she gathered the reins with practised ease and urged Artemis into a canter that left proper society gasping on the main path was something she would treasure for years to come. A mixture of surprise and delight, and something that looked remarkably like pride as he brought his stallion alongside hers and matched her pace without a word of caution or concern. They rode until the fashionable crowds thinned and the path wound through a quieter section of the park where ancient oaks created a canopy of green that filtered the morning light into something almost sacred. And there Frederick slowed his mount and began to speak of Ravenscroft in a voice she had never heard him use before this, soft with longing and loss as he described the rolling hills and the lake that reflected the sunset, and the jasmine that grew wild along the garden walls, filling summer evenings with a sweetness that made London's perfumed ballrooms seem garish by comparison. "I have not been home in nearly a year," he admitted, his eyes distant with memory, "because there is no one there to share it with, no one who would see it as anything more than an impressive estate to be catalogued and valued. And I find I cannot bear to walk those halls alone, knowing they were meant for a family I do not have." Eleanor heard the echo of her own loneliness in his confession, recognized the ache of spaces too empty and futures too uncertain, and when she spoke it was with a gentleness she rarely permitted herself. "Perhaps you simply needed to find someone who would love it for itself, not for what it represents." His answering look held such naked hope that she had to turn away, had to fix her gaze on Artemis's flowing mane rather than face the terrifying possibility that she might be that someone. And when Thomas Sinclair appeared on the path ahead and raised his hand in cheerful greeting, his knowing smile suggested he had witnessed far more than propriety would approve. But Eleanor found she could not bring herself to care about propriety when Frederick leaned close and murmured that he very much wanted her to see Ravenscroft herself some day, and soon. The evening of May 3rd, 1814, found Eleanor standing in the modest parlour of the Whitmore household, with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat and her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white, because Frederick Ashford, the Duke of Ravenscroft, was sitting in her mother's faded armchair beneath her father's portrait, a teacup balanced on his knee with an ease that suggested he took tea in shabby genteel poverty every afternoon, and the contrast between his immaculate dark coat and the worn upholstery, between his polished boots and the threadbare carpet, was so stark that Eleanor wanted to sink through the floorboards and disappear entirely. But he seemed utterly oblivious to the peeling wallpaper and the mended curtains and the careful poverty that permeated every corner of the room, his attention fixed instead on Mrs. Whitmore's rambling account of the Whitmore family history that Eleanor had been unable to interrupt for the past 20 minutes. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore was saying with a flutter of her handkerchief that made Eleanor cringe, "we are, of course, a respectable family, quite respectable, though circumstances have been somewhat reduced since my dear Mr. Whitmore passed. God rest him, and we have had to economize in certain ways that perhaps a man of your station might find, well, that is to say, Eleanor keeps telling me we should not apologize for honest circumstances, but I do feel I should explain about the tea service. It was my grandmother's, and the chip in the spout is hardly noticeable if one pours from the correct angle." Frederick's expression remained warmly attentive as he assured Mrs. Whitmore that the tea was excellent and the service charming, and when his eyes found Eleanor's across the room, the gentle understanding in them made her feel simultaneously grateful and exposed, as though he could see not only the chipped teapot, but all the careful mending and the strategic poverty and the years of making do with grace, and instead of pity, she saw only respect, a recognition of the dignity that such circumstances required, and something in her chest loosened fractionally, even as Lydia chose that moment to sigh dramatically and declare that she simply could not understand why His Grace would want to sit in their dreary parlour when there were so many grander drawing rooms in London. And Eleanor wished very much that her sister would develop a sudden and convenient case of laryngitis. Later, when Mrs. Whitmore had finally exhausted her nervous chatter, and Lydia had been dispatched to practice her pianoforte, Frederick asked if he might see the garden, and Eleanor led him through the cramped hall and out into the tiny walled space where her father had once grown roses that now struggled in neglected beds, their few blooms sparse and slightly wild. And Frederick looked at those imperfect flowers with an expression she could not quite read before turning to her and saying that he wanted to know all of her, not just the version she presented in ballrooms, but the woman who had grown up in this house with these struggling roses and that portrait of a father who clearly adored her. And Eleanor felt the last of her careful defences begin to crumble as she whispered that he might not like what he found beneath the wit and the walls. And his answering smile held a tenderness that made her fragile hope feel, for the first time, almost safe. The afternoon of May the 7th, 1814, began with such promise that Eleanor allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to happiness as she walked through Lady Beaumont's garden party on Harriet's arm, the spring sunshine warm on her shoulders, and the memory of Frederick's words in her mother's garden still echoing in her heart like a melody she could not stop humming. And when she spotted Lady Isabella Montague holding court beneath an ornamental pagoda, surrounded by her usual coterie of admirers and sycophants, she felt only a distant pity for a woman whose beauty had never required her to develop substance, a sentiment that would prove catastrophically premature within the hour. Eleanor had paused beside the refreshment table to pour herself a glass of lemonade when Isabella's voice carried across the manicured lawn with the precision of a thrown blade. "Darling Miss Whitmore, do come join us. We were just discussing the most delicious piece of gossip about a certain duke and his charitable endeavours." And something in Isabella's smile made Eleanor's blood run cold, even as social obligation propelled her feet forward into what she would later recognize as an ambush orchestrated with the ruthless efficiency of a military campaign. "The charity project," Isabella continued as Eleanor approached, her crystalline laugh drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. "That is what the gentlemen at White's have been calling you. Did you know? Apparently there is a wager in the betting books about how long His Grace can maintain the pretense of interest in a woman so obviously beneath his station." And the words struck Eleanor like physical blows, even as she struggled to keep her expression composed, though her hands had begun to tremble so violently that lemonade sloshed over the rim of her glass. "Some say it is a dare." Isabella pressed on with poisonous sweetness. "Others suggest he is merely amusing himself with the novelty of a spinster who does not know her place. But everyone agrees that the Duke of Ravenscroft could never seriously consider marriage to a plain, penniless, aging daughter of a ruined family. And I must say I admire your optimism in believing otherwise. It is almost touching in its delusion." Eleanor heard the gasps of the surrounding guests, as though from a great distance, saw Harriet pushing through the crowd with fury on her face, but all she could feel was the shattering of something fragile she had allowed herself to build, all her secret fears given voice in Isabella's cruel soprano. And before the first tear could escape, she turned and fled through the garden maze, with her vision blurring and her heart cracking along fault lines she had thought long since reinforced against exactly this kind of devastation. She did not see Frederick's carriage arrive 10 minutes later, did not witness Thomas Sinclair intercepting his friend with a grim expression and low, urgent words, did not observe the way Frederick's face transformed from anticipation to confusion to a cold white fury that made seasoned soldiers step backward, and she certainly did not hear him ask in a voice like winter steel where Eleanor had gone, and what exactly Lady Isabella had said. his hands already clenched at his sides as he strode toward the pagoda where Isabella's triumphant smile was beginning to falter. The evening of May 7th, 1814, found Eleanor barricaded in her small bedroom at the Whitmore household, with the curtains drawn against the fading light, and her face buried in a pillow that had long since grown damp with tears she had sworn never to shed over a man, over society, over the cruel confirmation of everything she had always known to be true about herself and her place in the world. And when the knock came at her door, she ignored it as she had ignored Harriet's concerned calls through the wood and her mother's bewildered questions about why she had returned home in such a state, and Lydia's thoughtless observation that she looked absolutely frightful, because nothing anyone could say would undo the public humiliation that had stripped away every fragile hope she had allowed herself to nurture in the past weeks like petals torn from a flower in a storm. The charity project. Isabella's voice echoed in her memory with poisonous clarity, and Eleanor pressed her hands against her ears, as though she could block out words that had already embedded themselves in her heart like shards of glass, because the worst part was not that Isabella had been cruel, but that Isabella had been right. That every whispered fear Eleanor had harbored since that first dance at the Harrington musicale had been confirmed by the betting books at White's, where gentlemen wagered on her humiliation like spectators at a cockfight, and she had been fool enough to believe that a man like Frederick Ashford could genuinely want a woman like her, when the entire world knew that dukes did not marry plain spinsters from financially ruined families, no matter how many first-edition books they gifted, or how intently they listened, or how gently they held one's hand in the back alcove of a bookshop while rain drummed against the windows. She had nearly believed him. That was the unbearable truth that made her chest ache, as though something vital had been crushed beneath the weight of her own foolish hope. She had looked into his eyes in her mother's shabby garden, among the struggling roses, and heard him say he wanted to know all of her, and she had almost let herself imagine a future where someone chose her, not despite her sharp tongue, and her philosophical books, and her too intelligent eyes, but because of them. And now that fragile imagining lay shattered on the manicured lawn of Lady Beaumont's garden party, where everyone had witnessed her flee like a wounded animal, while Isabella's crystalline laughter rang out in triumph. The second knock was more insistent, and this time Harriet's voice carried an urgency that finally penetrated Eleanor's misery. "Eleanor, you must come down immediately. His Grace is here, and he is refusing to leave until he speaks with you, and your mother is having palpitations, and I truly think you should see his face before you decide anything." And Eleanor lifted her head from the sodden pillow with her heart hammering against her ribs, because Frederick was here, in her house, after everything, and she did not know whether to feel hope or fury or terror at whatever explanation or dismissal or polite farewell he had come to deliver on this worst of all possible evenings. Eleanor descended the stairs on legs that trembled with each step, her face hastily washed and her hair still dishevelled from hours spent pressed against her pillow, and she told herself she was coming down only to end this properly, to hear whatever polite dismissal Frederick had prepared, and send him away before her mother's nerves collapsed entirely, or before she herself shattered into pieces too small to ever reassemble. But when she reached the bottom of the staircase, and saw him standing in their cramped front parlour, with his hat crushed in his hands, and his usually immaculate cravat askew, and an expression on his face she had never seen before, something wild and desperate that looked almost like fear, the dismissal she had prepared died on her lips, and she could only stand there staring at him while her mother fluttered uselessly in the corner, and Harriet positioned herself like a sentry by the door. "You came," Eleanor said flatly, and even she could hear how hollow her voice sounded, how stripped of the wit and fire that had first drawn his attention on that moonlit terrace a lifetime ago, and Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides until he stood close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw and smell the familiar sandalwood scent that had begun to mean safety, and now meant only pain. "I came the moment I heard," he said in a voice rough with emotion she could not read. "And I need you to listen to me, Eleanor. I need you to hear what I am about to say and believe it, because if Isabella Montague's poison has convinced you that anything she said contains even a grain of truth, then I have failed you in ways I will spend the rest of my life trying to repair." She opened her mouth to tell him it did not matter, that the damage was done, and the whole world now knew what she had always suspected about herself, and about the impossibility of a man like him genuinely wanting a woman like her. But he held up his hand, and the words died unspoken. "There is no wager," he continued, with an intensity that pinned her in place. "There is no dare. There is no charity, and no amusement, and no pretense. There is only you, Eleanor Whitmore, the most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered, the only person who has ever made me want to be worthy of something, and I have carried your note in my pocket every day since you sent back those roses, because it was the first time in my entire privileged, empty, suffocating life that someone saw through everything I was supposed to be and demanded that I be better." He reached into his coat and withdrew the cream paper with her initials that she had written in defiance 3 weeks ago, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and read countless times, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest that was not quite hope, but was no longer pure despair. "Isabella spoke from jealousy and spite," he said more quietly now, "and I have already ensured she will never move in good society again after tonight. But none of that matters if you cannot believe me when I tell you that you are not my charity project. You are my choice, my challenge, my equal. And if you will permit me, I intend to spend the rest of this courtship and every year that follows proving that you were right to demand better than roses." Eleanor stood motionless in her mother's parlour, with Frederick's words echoing through the small room, and his worn note trembling slightly in his outstretched hand. And she wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to take the offering of that creased paper, and let it mean everything he claimed it meant. But 6 seasons of disappointment and 1 afternoon of public humiliation had built walls around her heart that even his passionate declaration could not immediately breach, and so she heard herself say in a voice that shook only slightly, "How can I know this is real? How can I trust that tomorrow you will not wake and realize what everyone else already sees? That I am not worth the scandal, not worth the whispers, not worth a duke rearranging his entire life for a woman society has deemed worthy of nothing but pity and condescension." And she watched his face change as her words landed, watched something like anguish flicker across those aristocratic features, before it resolved into a determination so fierce it stole her breath. He closed the distance between them until they stood mere inches apart, closer than propriety allowed, closer than they had ever been, even in that rain-soaked alcove at Hatchard's. And when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, with an emotion that could not be feigned. "You ask how you can know," he said, "and I will tell you. You can know, because I have never in my life pursued anything with the dedication I have pursued you. You can know because I kept your note not as a trophy, but as a talisman. A reminder that somewhere in this shallow, glittering world there existed a woman brave enough to demand more than empty gestures. You can know because when Isabella spoke her venom today, my only thought was to find you, not to salvage my reputation or quiet the gossip, but to ensure that you understood your worth, even if it takes me the rest of my days to convince you of it." Eleanor felt the tears she had thought exhausted spring fresh to her eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them, did not armor herself with wit or deflection, because Frederick was looking at her as though she were precious, as though she were the answer to a question he had been asking his whole privileged, lonely life. and Harriet made a small sound from the doorway that might have been a sob, while Mrs. Whitmore pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in shock. "I am afraid," Eleanor whispered finally, letting him see the truth she had hidden from everyone, including herself. "I am afraid that I want this too much, that I have wanted it since that first night on the terrace when you listened to me ramble about philosophy and did not once look bored, and wanting things has only ever led to disappointment." And Frederick reached out and took her hand in his fingers warm and steady around her trembling ones, and he lifted that hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a vow. "Then let me prove it," he said against her skin. "Let me show you every day until you believe it. Let me do better than roses, Eleanor. Let me give you everything." And she looked into his eyes and saw not a duke or a prize or a fairy tale ending, but simply Frederick, the man who had remembered her words and treasured her defiance and crossed London to find her on her worst day. And something that had been frozen inside her for 27 years began slowly, tentatively, miraculously to thaw. The days that followed existed in a strange, suspended state that Eleanor could not quite name, a fragile truce between hope and terror in which Frederick called every afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock and sat in their modest parlour drinking tea he did not want, while Mrs. Whitmore fluttered and Lydia watched with bewildered fascination, and Eleanor herself felt as though she were learning to breathe again after years spent underwater, and each visit brought new revelations, small gifts that were never roses, but always precisely, impossibly perfect. A volume of Mary Wollstonecraft that he presented with a wry smile, and the comment that he suspected she would appreciate a fellow woman who refused to accept society's limitations, a pressed sprig of jasmine that he admitted came from Ravenscroft's gardens and smelled exactly like that first night on the terrace, a sketch he had commissioned of Artemis the mare because he had noticed how Eleanor's face transformed when she rode, and he wanted her to have something of that freedom even when propriety kept her earthbound. And with each offering, Eleanor felt another stone crumble from the walls she had spent 27 years constructing, until she began to fear there would soon be nothing left between her heart and his steady, patient, devastating attention. Society had not forgiven Lady Isabella's disgrace, and the whispers that now followed Eleanor through ballrooms and drawing-rooms had shifted in tone from mockery to something approaching awe. For the Duke of Ravenscroft had made his choice spectacularly clear, and no one quite knew what to make of a man who had rejected diamonds for years only to claim a woman everyone had dismissed as paste. And Eleanor heard the questions in every sidelong glance, saw the calculation in every suddenly warm smile from hostesses who had ignored her for 6 seasons, but she found she cared less about society's opinion with each passing day, because Frederick looked at her as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked, and that gaze was becoming impossible to doubt. On the 12th day after the garden party disaster, he arrived at the Whitmore household not at 3 o'clock, but at 11 in the morning, and when Eleanor descended to find him pacing in the parlour with an energy she had never seen from him before, he turned to her with eyes that held something sad and urgent, and said simply, "Come with me." And she should have refused, should have cited propriety and her mother's nerves, and the 1,000 rules that governed what unmarried women could and could not do. But instead she found herself reaching for her pelisse and following him out to his waiting carriage, while Mrs. Whitmore made sounds of incoherent protest that neither of them acknowledged. He handed her up into the carriage and settled across from her, and as the horses began to move, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together and said, "I am taking you to Ravenscroft. I know it is irregular. I know your mother may never recover, but I find I cannot wait another day for you to see it, to see where I want to build a life with you, because I am going to ask you to marry me, Eleanor Whitmore, and I need you to understand exactly what you would be accepting before you give me your answer." The journey to Ravenscroft took nearly 3 hours, and Eleanor spent much of it in a state of suspended disbelief, watching the city give way to countryside through the carriage window, while Frederick sat across from her with an expression of barely contained anticipation that made him look younger than his 32 years, and she found herself cataloguing the details of this moment because she suspected she would want to remember it forever, regardless of how the day ended. The way the spring sunlight caught the gold in his brown hair, the way his hands kept flexing against his thighs as though he could not quite contain his nervous energy, the way he looked at her every few minutes as if to reassure himself that she was real and present and had not vanished like some fever dream. And when the carriage finally turned onto a long drive lined with ancient oaks, she heard him exhale slowly and say, "This is where I grew up. This is the only place I have ever felt truly myself, and I wanted you to see it before I asked you to share it with me." The house appeared gradually through the trees, a sprawling stone manor that managed to be grand without being ostentatious, covered in climbing roses that were just beginning to bud, and surrounded by gardens that even in early May showed evidence of careful, loving tending. And Eleanor felt something catch in her throat because this was not the cold, imposing estate she had imagined, but rather a home. A place that spoke of generations and history and the kind of roots she had always craved. And when Frederick helped her down from the carriage, she noticed that his hands trembled slightly, and that observation undid something in her chest that she had not known was still knotted. He led her through the house without ceremony, pointing out his favorite window seat where he had read as a child, the library that contained over 1,000 volumes and smelled of leather and old paper, the music room where his mother had played piano every evening until her death 8 years ago, and Eleanor saw with sudden clarity that this man who had seemed so untouchable and remote was, in fact, profoundly lonely, had been building walls of his own for just as long as she had been building hers, and when they finally stepped through a set of glass doors onto a terrace overlooking gardens that stretched to a distant lake, she understood why he had needed to bring her here, because this was Frederick without his armor. Frederick vulnerable and hopeful, and offering her not just his title or his wealth, but the truth of who he was. The gardens were full of jasmine, the scent rising sweet and familiar on the warm spring air, and Eleanor closed her eyes and remembered a moonlit terrace in London where a stranger had listened to her speak and had not looked bored, and she felt Frederick move to stand beside her, felt the warmth of him close enough to touch, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, and she opened her eyes to find him looking at her with everything he felt written plainly on his face. "I have spent 32 years believing I would never find someone who could see past the title to the man beneath, and then you sent back my roses." She laughed then, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him, and she said, "You sent roses to a woman who had just told you that roses are what men send when they cannot be bothered to know a woman." And he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, and he said, "I needed to know if you meant it. I needed to know if you were truly different, or if you would fold like every other woman who has ever told me what she thought I wanted to hear. And you." Eleanor Whitmore sent them back with a note that I have carried in my breast pocket every day since March, and he reached into his coat and withdrew a piece of cream paper worn soft at the edges, and she recognized her own handwriting, her own initials pressed into the corner, and something cracked open in her chest at the evidence that he had treasured her defiance rather than resented it. "I have spent 6 seasons watching men look through me," she said quietly, and her voice did not waver, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I have spent 27 years being told that my value lies in my face and my fortune and my youth, and finding myself lacking in all 3. And when Lady Isabella said you were courting me as a charity project or a joke, She was only saying aloud what I had been whispering to myself since the night you first spoke to me on that terrace, because the alternative, the possibility that you might actually want me, that you might see something in me worth wanting, that possibility was too terrifying to believe. Frederick reached out then and took her face in both his hands, his palms warm against her cheeks, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized she was shedding, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from any man. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "You are the most infuriating, magnificent, impossibly brilliant woman I have ever met. You challenged me when no one else dared. You saw through my title to the lonely man beneath. You made me work for your attention, and in doing so, you showed me what it means to truly earn something worth having. And if you think for one moment that I would travel 3 hours to show you my home, that I would introduce you to every corner of the only place I have ever loved, that I would stand here in my mother's garden with my heart in my hands, if this were anything less than the most sincere and desperate love I have ever felt, then you do not know me at all. And I find I very much want you to know me, Eleanor. I want you to know every broken and hopeful piece of me. I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to know every piece of you in return." He reached into his pocket again and withdrew a small velvet box, and when he opened it, she saw a ring that was clearly old, clearly precious, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the afternoon light and scattered it across the jasmine blooms around them. And he said, "This was my mother's. She told me to give it only to a woman who made me feel truly alive. And Eleanor, you make me feel as though I have been sleepwalking through my entire existence until the moment you looked up from your book and told a stranger that society balls are tedious. So I am asking you, here in the gardens of Ravenscroft, with jasmine in the air and my heart entirely in your hands, will you marry me?" She could not speak at first, could only stand there in the jasmine-scented garden of Ravenscroft, with the afternoon sun warm on her face, and Frederick Ashford, Duke of Ravenscroft, the man who had pursued her with patience and intention, and a stubbornness that matched her own, kneeling before her with his mother's ring in his hands, and his heart written plainly across every line of his beautiful face. And she thought of all the years she had spent believing that love was something that happened to other women. To women with golden hair and musical laughs and dowries that could tempt even the most reluctant suitor, she thought of 6 seasons spent pressed against ballroom walls watching couples dance past her as though she were nothing more than furniture. She thought of whispered comments about her age and her plainness and her unfortunate habit of having opinions. She thought of the night she had retreated to a moonlit terrace with Seneca for company, and had found instead this impossible man who had looked at her as though she were the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. And she thought of roses returned, and books given, and a waltz that had silenced an entire room, and letters that had cracked her heart open and put it back together in a new configuration. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged steady and clear and certain in a way she had not known she was capable of. "Yes," she said, and the word felt inadequate to contain everything she meant by it. So she said it again. "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you. I will marry you and live in this beautiful house that smells of jasmine and contains 1,000 books and the memory of a mother who loved you. I will marry you and challenge you and infuriate you and love you with every stubborn, opinionated, intelligent part of myself that society told me to hide. I will marry you, not because you are a duke, or because you are wealthy, or because you are the most handsome man I have ever seen, though you are certainly all of those things, but because you sent me roses knowing I would send them back. Because you gave me Seneca, and remembered my father, and rode beside me in Hyde Park, and sat in my family's shabby parlour as though it were a palace. Because you wrote me a letter that made me believe I might be worth wanting, after all. Because when Lady Isabella tried to destroy me, you destroyed her instead, without ever raising your voice, because you brought me here, Frederick. You brought me to the place where you feel most yourself, and you showed me every corner of it, and that is not something a man does for a charity project or a joke. That is something a man does when he wants a woman to know him truly. And I find that I want to know you truly, too. I want to know what you look like first thing in the morning and last thing at night. I want to know which books you reach for when you are sad. I want to know the sound of your laugh when no one else is listening. I want all of it, Frederick, every broken and hopeful piece. So yes, my answer is yes. It has been yes since you quoted Seneca back to me in a bookshop while rain fell outside. I simply did not have the courage to admit it until now. Frederick rose from his knees and slid the sapphire ring onto her finger where it fit as though it had been waiting for her all along. And then he kissed her there in his mother's garden, with jasmine blooming around them and the whole of their future spreading out before them like the endless green lawns of Ravenscroft. And Eleanor Whitmore, 27 years old and a spinster no longer, kissed him back with 6 seasons' worth of loneliness transformed into joy.